In deference to my wife, Isabel, you can thank her for this. She says that I ramble and that I go on and on and on, and so I will take the opportunity to temper myself by placing my clock here so that I can keep track of the time. I'm noted for my rather lengthy lectures. Some of them have gone on for in excess of 5 hours. I don't think anyone here is interested in 5 hours worth. Geology. How many mothers here have inspected their sons' pockets and found pebbles and rocks inside of their pockets? There are only two kinds of little boys. Little boys that are collecting rocks because they found something special in it. They only account for about 3 out of 10. The others are collecting rocks so they have something for their slingshot. I, unfortunately, was one of the previous collectors of rocks. And I was admonished on many occasions for carrying large quantities of rocks into my bedroom. As a small child, born in Philadelphia, and then my sister passed away, and my father, so distraught was he that he resigned his position, moved to Europe to live with relatives in Heidelberg for a short period of time, and they suggested that we take the wonderful healing airs of the Mediterranean, and we moved to Naples, Italy for about 3 months, and there I discovered Vesuvius. What an opportunity. My father spent more money on the funicular railway going up and down the slopes of Vesuvius while we were there, I believe, than he spent on food. And I was very grateful for the opportunity to do that. But God called him back to the ministry as the Bishop of Southwestern Ohio, and he moved to Cincinnati. I remind you that Cincinnati was on the frontier. As I grew up, my love for the outdoors increased dramatically, and my first job out of high school was with a survey crew. And we went from the Arizona Territory through the American West over a 5-month period of time, all the way to the Yellowstone Territory. Many of you may be familiar with that area. I understand that it's quite popular now in the territory of Wyoming. What we were surveying were many of the extinct volcanoes that are in that part of the world for that 5-month period of time. There's a photograph here. As we approached Yellowstone, for about 3 days, the wind coming out of the north into our nostrils was filled with the scent of decaying flesh. The horses were quite nervous about it because they identified, apparently, that smell as a bear. As we got closer, we breasted the arroyo that you see here and discovered that the scent that we were witnessing came from 8 corpses of bears that were lying in this arroyo in various states of decomposition. It was obvious that they had not died by any hostile means, by any mechanics of man. And in an effort to discover why they had died, I took my hammer out of my backpack and I threw it at this bear right here. When I first encountered him, his nose, or his paw, was across his nose, and when I hit his body, the paw dropped away from his nose, revealing traces of dried blood in his nostrils, a sure sign that he had died of carbon dioxide poisoning in the outdoors. We were quite amazed, but what it told us was that somewhere down there in this arroyo, there was a pool of carbon dioxide deep enough that he could not raise his muzzle above the ground to walk away. Well, that was all well and good. We discovered the source of their death. But now my hammer is down inside that pool of carbon dioxide. And we didn't know how deep it was. So I took one of the camp lanterns that we had, I lit it, I held it out at arm's length and walked down in there. I'm 17 years old. The people who were in the survey party are all well into their 40s, old men, each and every one of them. They were not concerned about my hammer at all. But I walked down, and just as I got down next to where my hammer was located, I lowered the lantern down until just above my knee, the flame extinguished in the carbon dioxide, telling us that the depth of that pool was about to the level of my knee. I retrieved my hammer and we rode on and completed our task. And that was a wonderful life lesson about what you can expect to find around volcanoes. There are surprises sometimes at every turn, and some of them totally unexpected. As I neared graduation in my undergraduate classes, my father, concerned that I might become a professional stage magician, suggested that I might find something else to study and graduate as my major. And my youthful love of rocks became what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. I took my Bachelor of Science at Harvard in geology. I went on from there back to Heidelberg to live with part of my family, and I took my master's degree at Harvard, at Heidelberg and Munich universities, and ultimately back to Harvard for my PhD. My study at that point in time, and my doctorate, my thesis was written on the activity of waves on the subsurface of the ocean, and making those wave patterns became my passion. And being able to cement those into some solid form became the source of my continuing study. And then in 1902, after I had been promoted to the head of the Department of Geology at both Harvard and MIT, tragedy struck in the world that changed my life forever. In April of 1902, Mount Pelée, no relation to the woman I'm sure that lives here on the island, erupted on the island of Martinique in the Caribbean. A catastrophic eruption in the form of a nuée ardente, the French call it, very romantic sounding name. This is a pyroclastic flow. The internal temperature of this cloud coming down 4,000 foot tall Mount Pelée, we can estimate well in excess of 450 degrees Fahrenheit. Wood and paper spontaneously ignited in its path. And the winds generated by this cloud coming down the side of the mountain far exceeded those of a hurricane, perhaps as much as 100 miles per hour. Now, if it had gone down any other slope of that mountain and through sugarcane fields into the ocean, I wouldn't be here. But it took dead aim on the port city of Saint-Pierre, the source of the shipments of sugarcane that came out of Martinique and off to France. And in the 10 minutes it took for that cloud to pass over the city, it left the city in ruin and took with it the population of 29,000 people. 29,000 lives in a span of 10 minutes, and leaving the mountain significantly disfigured. Now, as it turned out, two of my colleagues, one at Harvard and one at MIT, had both been to Mount Pelée before, and they were quite anxious for the opportunity to be able to go and see what changes had transpired on Mount Pelée. And at their urging, we mounted an expedition. Well, of course, the first problem with every expedition is trying to find transportation to remote parts of the world. Martinique is located in the Lesser Antilles, way out on the edge of the Caribbean Sea. Inquiries were made about the ships that lay in Boston Harbor, and one of them was actually destined to go to Saint-Pierre. How fortuitous. But then we found out that the ship needed to return to France before going on to the Caribbean. They would be in transit for nearly 5 months. Too long a period of time, we felt, to take advantage of that as a transportation source. Inquiries were sent and cables were sent to every available shipping line in hopes of being able to divert a ship for our purposes. As I sat in my office later that afternoon, I remember distinctly that there was a knock on the door. I opened the door, and standing there in my doorway was a young naval officer. I was quite surprised. I asked if I could help him, and his immediate inquiry was whether I was Professor Jaggar. I'm assuming that naval officers receive some kind of education about what to expect on the other side of a door that has someone's name on it. And I was not disappointed. He told me that, yes, if I was Professor Jaggar, that I would need to go with him to my home to pack a bag. I honestly thought that he was there to conscript me, and I told him I have no usable talents in the military, certainly not for the Navy. He said, no, sir, you misunderstand. It turns out that President Roosevelt had dispatched him to escort me to the Navy Yard in New York. The President had made arrangements for a ship at the Brooklyn Navy Yard to be at my disposal for the next 6 months. And the following morning, along with 4 of my colleagues, 2 from Harvard and 2 from MIT, we sailed aboard the warship Dixie, a training ship. Joining us on the cruise were between 80 and 100 members of the press. It took us 12 days down the coast of the United States and into the Caribbean before we arrived in the shallow draft harbor at Saint Pierre. When we arrived there on the afternoon of the 12th day, we were awestruck by the scene of destruction that was there. It was just impossible to believe that that had happened in a span of 10 minutes. And within the city now, there were 7 columns of thick black smoke rising from different parts of the city. My colleagues and I looked at one another in amazement. What was the source of fuel for something that could burn on? This eruption had taken place 14 days before. 2 full weeks had transpired. We were simply not prepared to guesstimate what could possibly be the source of fuel for these fires until we walked up to the base of one of them and discovered that the fuel were the bodies that were being extracted from the ruins of the city. No other means of disposal was available, and the pyres burned night and day for 2 months. 29,000 people. If there's a bright spot in any of this story, it occurred just a day before we arrived. And let me backtrack for just a moment. After the eruption had taken place, on the 9th day after the eruption, searchers had come from the surrounding islands and from other parts of Martinique in hopes of being able to find survivors. And they organized a door-to-door, block-by-block search of the entire city if there were survivors, and finding none, they assembled in the square outside the ruins of the police station to call off their search for any living people. And they were overheard there by a black man named Auguste Sipari. He had been arrested 3 days before the eruption for stealing plantains, bananas. He told us in an interview that he was merely trying to feed his family, but because he was known to the gendarme as a habitual criminal, he had been incarcerated not in a jail cell, but in the dungeon below the jail, walls of stone a meter thick, the only opening to the outside world, an air bore approximately this size. And he heard the people outside saying there were no survivors. He told us that he yelled out, I'm here, but his voice would not carry through the air bore. He tried reaching through, but his arm wasn't long enough. He searched frantically on the floor of his cell for anything that he could thrust out through there, and he found a fork and a spoon, and in order to elongate them, joined them, thrust them out out through the wall, and just the end of the fort protruded through into the sunlight, and the glint from the end of the fort caught the eye of one of the searchers. He recalled his colleagues, and they spent the balance of the day deconstructing the wall to free him from what surely would have been his tomb. Mr. Setbury's testimony notwithstanding, he was not the real reason that we were there. We were there to see the mountain, and we were able to secure the services of an English-speaking guide who, though he didn't live in the city, knew it well enough to be able to take us up through now the rubble-strewn streets, all filled with roof tiles and the beautiful colored plaster that made up the homes of Saint-Pierre, to take us to a square at the top of the city. He said from there was a trailhead that would lead us out onto the mountain and give us the best possible access. And we followed him up, and we arrived at the square at the top of the city, and we could see the trailhead on the other side. But between us and the trailhead was a pram, seeming to us out of place, until we walked up to it and realized the nature of the tragedy that we were witnessing. A nurse had taken her charge out that beautiful spring morning, and seeing the cloud now coming down the mountain with nowhere to run, had sacrificed her body across the pram in an effort to protect the child. But the flesh was burned off of both of their bones. We were in Saint-Pierre for 4 months. And almost daily we made trips onto the mountain to see what changes had transpired there during the course of the eruption. And on those days when there was cloud cover or rain, we opted to help with the removal of dead from the city at the conclusion of our 4 months there. We boarded the Dixie for the return trip to the Northeast. And on our way north, on that 12-day voyage, I reviewed the notes that I had written daily in my journals, paying particular attention to the notes that pertained to the loss of life. And I determined that the best possible use of the balance of my working life, whatever it was, would be to study volcanoes so that I could learn where and when and how they were going to erupt, so that I could take populations who potentially were in peril and be able to move them someplace where they would be safe for the sole purpose and intent of protecting their lives. And when I announced my intention to do that, my colleagues, my learned and esteemed colleagues from both institutions of higher education, greeted that announcement with laughter and derision. Several of my colleagues actually laughed in my face. Others snickered as they walked away. One of my colleagues was so bold as to tell me that my job was to study rocks, not to save people's lives. And their new nickname for me on both campuses became Tom Jaggar, the scientific missionary. Well, I am here today, at least in part because of that derision. In 1906, I returned to Vesuvius to observe the eruption that was taking place there, the largest eruption since the 79 AD eruption that I'm sure you all read about when you were translating Pliny the Lesser in your Latin classes. And when I was there, I had the opportunity to meet Frank Perret. Frank Perret is an American engineer. He had a company up in Connecticut. He was building batteries for these newfangled electric automobiles. And he sold that company, apparently at quite a handsome profit. Some of you have heard, I'm sure, of Perret batteries. No? No one reads the trade magazines, apparently. So Frank retired from that, and Frank is just as enamored with volcanoes as I am, but Frank has a different approach. He has a giant cone that he sets on the ground, and he uses the stethoscope to listen to the machinations, as he calls them, of the mountain through this giant cone that he sets on the ground. He was at Kilauea in 1905 for about 5 months, and not finding what he was looking for here, he moved to the slopes of Vesuvius in 1906, and within 3 months predicted that Vesuvius was going to erupt, and it did. Brilliant man. Well, while I was there, I had the opportunity to meet him for the first time, and I invited him on a program that I was set to go on to the Aleutians, 1,000-mile-long archipelago, one volcano after another after another. I had chartered a 63-foot schooner. We were going to be gone for 93 days, and I asked if he would like to come along, and he did. And while we were sitting there on the deck of the ship between islands, we talked about how wonderful it would be if we were to have 50 observers who lived each one on their individual mountain around the globe and were able to record the hour-to-hour and day-to-day changes in their particular mountain to be able to share with the 49 others. And in fact, as a result of our discussions about that, I wrote that up in the papers that I wrote about the trip through the Aleutians. It received very little reading, but enough that people became aware of that. Here's Frank right here with his tone. And then in 1909, at the behest of Omori of Japan, the manufacturer of the Bosch Omori thermometer, used to measure the seismic activities in the mountain. Professor Omori and I had met on several occasions at conferences we had attended in common, and now he wanted me to come to Japan. But travel to Japan, Caucasian, was not possible at that point in time, until in 1908, Teddy Roosevelt sent the Great White Fleet around the globe, opening the ports of Asia to Western travel. Ellen and I, my wife, decided that we would go to Japan. And so we took our daughter across country by train, we deposited her with her grandparents in San Francisco, and we boarded a steamer there for Honolulu, because at that time there was no direct transit from San Francisco all the way to the Japanese islands. When we arrived in Honolulu, it was the first inkling that Helen had that we had an 8-day layover in the Hawaiian Islands before proceeding on, and she was beside herself. Good God, she said, what are we going to do for 8 days in this backwater hellhole? And I said, well, look, the ocean is very nice. We could go for a swim. And with a glare, she stared at me. She said, 3 minutes in this sun, my skin will be ruined forever. I said, well, here, try one of these pineapple-flavored rum drinks. They're quite attractive. She even refused my offer of alcohol, which was quite out of character for her on my day. In searching for any possible diversion that I might attract her with, I said, I have an idea. We could take a small steamer from Honolulu down to the port of Hilo. We could board a train there that would take us to the summit of Kilauea. We could see the ongoing eruption that's taking place there. And she said she wouldn't enjoy doing that at all. And I said, well, that's truly unfortunate because I've already booked our passage for leaving. Much the same as many people did during that period of time, we took the train up to Glenwood and boarded the stagecoach there that took us on to the volcano house. Now, at that time, the lava lake at the summit of Kilauea was just absolutely amazing. Imagine, if you will, in your mind's eye for just a moment, acre upon acre of molten lava on the surface of the earth, swirling around in a magnificent gyre, and fountains of lava shooting into the air, some of them as tall as a 4- or 5-story building, and these massive gas bubbles, some of them 20 feet across, coming up with volcanic gases and exploding and sending the molten lava spewing onto the banks of the area. They're releasing their sulfuric fumes. And at night, the glow from the lava lake into the clouds above. Well, even for people who are non-believers, it gives one pause to think of the very close proximity between paradise and eternal damnation. While we were there, we had the opportunity to meet this man. He was a guide at that point in time, Mr. Alexander. A man of unknown origin. He may be black, he may be Asian, No one really knew, but he knew the mountains around Kilauea like the back of his hand. And he was able to share with us the summit of Kilauea. And finally, it came time for us to return to Honolulu after 3 days. And we took the opportunity to return to Honolulu. And I was greeted there by a gentleman by the name of Loren Thurston. Many of you probably know him. He's the publisher of the Honolulu newspaper, for those of you who don't know him, the Pacific Commercial Advertiser. Mr. Thurston at that time was also working with a group of people trying to build a university within the territory of Hawaii, and he was quite excited about the prospect of me being in Hawaii, to the point where he asked if I would be willing to deliver a lecture so that people would have the opportunity to experience a lecture from a true Ivy League professor without having to go all the way to the East Coast of the United States for their education. My ego would not allow me not to do that, and I said, hire a hall, and I'd be more than happy to do so. And hire a hall they did. The largest hall in Honolulu, and they filled it to capacity, much the same as we have here, standing room only. Regrettably far better than many of my classes at either Harvard or at MIT. And I delivered the lecture of my lifetime. I gave them 3.5 hours of hellfire volcanology, and it was followed by 2.5 hours of questions and answers. We were late into the evening when I finally called the evening to a close. Helen and I were scheduled to board our ship to go on to Japan the following morning with an early embarkation time, and I called the evening to a close, and I asked for one more question, and it came from Mr. Thurston. He obviously was one of the very few people who had read my papers about the trip that I made through the Aleutians, and he asked if Kilauea would be an appropriate place for one of these observatories that I had talked about. And I told him I couldn't think of a better place on earth. He said, well, what would be involved in being able to do something like that? And I said, well, that, I'm afraid, is a question for another time, because if we get into that, we'll be here until tomorrow afternoon sometime. But he and I agreed to meet after I returned from the Japanese islands, and the following morning Helen and I sailed. I won't bore you with the details of that trip. Suffice it to say that traveling with Omori, who was regarded as if he were a living treasure, gave us the same mantle to wear, and we enjoyed our trip through the Japanese islands tremendously. And I do plan on returning. Plans are underway for us to return again at some point in the future, particularly to be able to observe the mountain called Sakurajima at the south end of Honshu Island. When we returned to Honolulu, as the ship was nosing into the dock, I glanced down on the pier, and standing next to the gangway was Loren Thurston. He was quite excited to get an invitation for Helen and I to a luncheon 2 days hence to be held at Washington Place, the home of the Territorial Governor Walter Freer. I was to be the guest of honor. And what he had done is assemble members of the business and government communities together to be able to hear about the prospect of an observatory at Kilauea and what would be required to do that. And the first question after lunch we served was, what do we need to do? And I said, well, you're going to need to find a scientist, someone who is sufficiently erudite to be able to study the hour-to-hour and day-to-day changes of the mountain, and then be able to turn it into some kind of usable science that can be published by a reputable university. And one of the gentlemen that was there said, well, we were hoping we could attract you. I said, me? You understand that I'm a tenured professor at 2 universities. I have certain salary expectations that I anticipate receiving, and they said, we're fully aware of that, and we are prepared to meet or exceed your salary requirements, and further that we will pay for your expenses to move from Boston to the island of Hawaii. I said, well, that's quite generous, and I would have to take them under advisement. And they said, what else would we need? And I said, well, you'll need certain pieces of equipment. They said, equipment, like what? And I, fortunately, was just back from Japan, and I had pictures of Omori's machines, the thermometers. And I said, you're going to need thermometers. They said, well, what do they use for? And I said, to measure the seismic movement of the mountain. And they said, how much did one of them cost? And when I told them, they were aghast. There was a pall over the room. I said, what seems to be the problem? He said, well, we simply just don't know whether we can afford you and one of those machines. I said, well, the problem is even greater than you would have expected because we don't need one of those machines, we need 5 of them. I said, good God, where do people find money for something like that? And one of the business people, I noticed that he'd been very quiet during the course of lunch and the conversation up to that point, raised his hand and said, does MIT have money for something like that? And I said, well, I was just getting to that. Because MIT was recently granted a sum of $10,000 for the express purpose of building such a geonomic observatory. Huzzahs went up, they were congratulating themselves all around. I said, no, wait, you need to hear the rest of my statement. They said, what else could possibly be wrong with that? And I said, well, that grant comes with the further stipulation that that geonomic observatory be built in that hotbed of volcanology, Boston, Massachusetts. They said, that's money that's wasted. I said, you're preaching to the choir. They said, well, there's bound to be money left over. Can you get some of that for us? And I said, all I can do is ask. Well, I returned to Boston and to Cambridge, and I met with President McLaren and the Board of Regents, and I put forth a proposal on behalf of the newly formed Hawaiian Volcano Research Association. And I mentioned at the conclusion of my remarks that they were short of money for equipment and were wondering perhaps that there was some way to get some money from the Whitney account. I no sooner got the name Whitney out of my mouth, one of the regents at the far end of the table jumped up and said, no. Edward B. Hairline were very specific about that money being spent right here in Boston. And I'll be honest with you, I was so off-put by their reaction to my request that I did, like several of my colleagues have deemed unthinkable. I made an appointment the following day with Ann Whitney, the executrix of the estate, and also my wife's good friend, and I pledged her. And for as little as $100,000 of your family's wealth, we could build 50 of these geonomic observatories around the globe. Your family's name would be synonymous with volcanic exploration for millennia to come. And she agreed that I had a compelling argument, yes, and a wonderful way to celebrate her family's wealth. And then revealed to me, and I believe for the first time to anyone outside of her immediate family, that the extent of her family's estate was not nearly as grand as people had estimated. However, if you can imagine having the opportunity to do this in your lifetime, she walked over to her secretary, pulled out her checkbook, opened it up, wrote out an additional check to the Institute in the amount of $15,000 that did not specify on the bottom of the check that the money be spent in Boston, Massachusetts. Well, you've only just met me, but you can appreciate fully the enthusiasm that I had the following day, sitting in my office, gazing at this $15,000 voucher for any and all equipment I could ever possibly dream of. And then I heard the dean's footfalls outside the door of my office. Are any of you involved in academia? I see a lot of people suddenly sitting on their hands. Yes. How many of you can tell me how to know who the deans of the colleges are on the university campus? It's quite simple. If they have no money, they're walking around to everyone they meet begging for it. And when they finally get some money in their hands are closed so tightly around it. If you look at the people on campus with white knuckles, I assure you, those are the deans of the college. And there was no difference in this man at all. Without even the courtesy of a knock, he burst into my office and said, what do you mean by going to see Ann Whitney? I said, just trying to fund my program. He says, well, you leave the Whitneys out of this. They've been very generous to the school in the past. And at that moment, he pried open his greedy little fingers and snatched that $15,000 check out of my hand and stormed out of my office. He didn't even say thank you. Oh, it still boils my blood. Fortunately, 11 days later, a letter arrived on President McLaren's desk from the Hawaii Volcano Research Association declaring that they had secured sufficient money and pledges to cover my salary for a period of 5 years, wanting to know if the Institute would put money into equipment for the rights to publish the science that was gathered at Kilauea. The regents reconvened and they reconsidered our request. and in their wisdom, they granted us the interest money from all $25,000 of the Whitney funds that they had for a period of 5 years in exchange for our promise that we would publish all the science gathered at Kilauea through MIT, and further, that I would resign as the head of the Department of Geology at both Harvard and the Institute. And I was perfectly agreeable to do that. And the result of that was the building that you see here. A very shabby start. It was followed by this wonderful basement that we dug to be able to house our seismic equipment. And the installation took place over the period of several years, to the point where we became one of the foremost seismological exploration facilities in the world. You can see here, this is in November of 1912. We finally got to this level of expertise. Oops. Work went on in the observatory from 1912 onwards, from January of 1912 when I arrived here, and we were able finally to get to that. Accompanying me was my favorite dog, Teddy, a border collie, who was my constant companion during the early years, and he was replaced after his death by Teddy 2. And here, wife number 1 was replaced by wife number 2. Isabel Manuel, many of you may know her. She was a widow who lived here in Kona. Her husband was the prosecutor, the county attorney and prosecutor in the Kona district for quite a while, and he passed away after a brief illness. And I met her at the Volcano House, and she became my constant companion from that point forward. With all of her foibles, correcting me on a constant basis, but she was shoulder to shoulder with me from that point forward in my working life. She rode with me on muleback to the summit of Mauna Loa on more than one occasion, nearly freezing to death in a blizzard during one of those expeditions, until finally we got to 1924. Kilauea, most people know, is a very gentle volcano with its effusive flows and building itself up. But in 1924, a massive deflation of the summit resulted in the clouds that you see here. These went on for days and days. And unfortunately, Isabel and I were in the Caribbean, as fate would have it. But the account that was taken care of was recorded dutifully by my wonderful assistant, Roy Finch. More about Roy in a little while. That cloud coming up out of the pit, the magma that was in there receded dramatically, and water from the water table soared into the hole that was left by the magma, and the rocks that were alongside of the hole that was left by the magma fell in, and when they would block the vent of the gases trying to get out, it would frequently spit rocks out like this one, weighing on the order of 17 tons. You saw earlier people crowded around the cloud to be able to observe that. People actually drove their automobiles right up to the edge. And I wasn't there to prohibit that. And this rock, unfortunately, fell on the leg of one of the photographers, and his leg was pinned there, and the rock so heavy that we couldn't move it. They amputated his leg on the spot, and he died of the resultant, one of the very few fatalities that have happened at Kilauea on my watch. The pit crater, called Mauna, suddenly opened up and became less of a lava lake on the surface and more of a caldera. down below. I took the opportunity to bring an automobile up there before there were roads. And I'm afraid that I gave Mr. Ford's automobile the ultimate test before the roads happened there. And this poor old beat-up jalopy with me at the wheel eventually turned into this. During my trip through the Aleutians, I was sometimes frustrated by the inability to be able to land on some of the islands. And so I thought what a wonderful idea it would be if we had a boat that would turn into a car that we could drive through the surf and up onto the land to be able to observe the islands that were there and be able to drive up onto the volcanoes. And so I took the engine out of that car and I put it into this boat and put it up on wheels. And this is down at Keauhou Bay. You'll see me here at the wheel along with Mr. Thurston, and Isabel is in there somewhere, in the back of the boat. And we tested this out a great deal in Keauhou Bay, and we found that it worked beautifully well. And ultimately that design led us to this. Also in 1935, I had the opportunity to meet Amelia Earhart. She came to the volcano before her flight from Hawaii to California, the first person to make a solo flight from Hawaii to the mainland of the United States. Also during 1935, Mauna Loa erupted. The first opportunity that Hawaii Volcano Observatory had to accurately predict an eruption. Following all of the activity that had taken place and the buildup of the seismic events that took place, we accurately predicted that Mauna Loa would erupt within the summit caldera. And further, that eruption would move and migrate down onto the slope of Mauna Loa around the 9,500-foot elevation, and the lava would continue to flow down into the Humu'ula Saddle, where it would reach the saddle, the floor of the saddle, and move off to the west toward Kauai High and be no problem. And 18 days later, the eruption took place in the summit caldera, Mopua Be'o. And 7 days later, it migrated down the slope into the Humu'ula Saddle, and the lava went down to the floor of the saddle and immediately turned east toward Hilo. The city fathers in Hilo were not particularly pleased with the prospect of having their water source, the headwaters of the Wailuku River, overrun. And they came to us and asked what we could possibly do. Well, Guido Giacometti and I put our heads together and we thought, well, possibly the best thing we could do would be to get a wagon full of TNT and get some mules and drive it up to the eruptive site and be able to divert the lava flow. And that problem became problematic because we discovered that there wasn't enough TNT on the island to make that happen. Mr. Giacometti said, well, what about the Army? I said, what about the Army? He said, they have bombers on Oahu. They could bomb that event right out of existence. And so we contacted the Army and their planes at Fort Island. Here's the typical bomber from that era. Loaded up each one of them with 4 600-pound bombs. And they came over, we met, we discussed what would be probably the most beneficial way to be able to make that happen. The sortie was set up, the first plane went in to drop its bombs, it dropped 2 bombs. It hit directly into the vent and sprayed molten lava up and burned holes in the lower wings of the plane. The planes immediately started to take a higher altitude back. Of the 20 bombs that were dropped, 16 of them hit their target. 4 of them missed. They left craters 20 feet across and 4 feet deep. 2 days later, the lava flow ceased. We're just not really sure that that was just coincidental. But I would like to think that I was the person responsible for saving Hilo, and I'm willing to take the responsibility for having made that happen. And so here we are today, Hawaiian Volcano Observatory. And you can see the volcano house in the background. We're very pleased with what we've been able to build there and the work that we've been able to do. And 3 months ago, Volcano House burned to the ground. The decision was made at that point in time that the Volcano House would be moved to the site that is currently occupied by the observatory, and the observatory would be moved eventually to Uwe Kahana on the other side of the caldera, and there we would take up our observations once again. And so our home now for the last 28 years is about to be demolished. Here you can see the position of Volcano House, and here is the observatory. And way out here on an outcropping is the home that Isabella and I have enjoyed for the last 22 years, Kualono. Kualono, what a magnificent place to be. Set onto an outcropping into the caldera itself, a public room, a guest room, and our room and my office all combined together in that one area. And the wall on the caldera side of our bedroom is nothing but panes of glass. The view is unexcelled anywhere in the world. And it has been a joy to live there. But now, the U.S. government has decided that I am too old to work. In an effort to be able to mitigate the recent economic unpleasantness, a mandatory retirement age of 67 has been announced. That would have been 2 years ago. And I begged Franklin Roosevelt for an extension because of the work that we were doing. And Franklin was very kind and said, yes, I understand. Please go ahead. I'll grant you an extension on your retirement. And we worked diligently trying to complete the projects that we were working on. But it was so easy to get an exemption from him that I applied for another one, and he said, well, okay, Tom, it's not a problem. We'll do that one more time. But there will be no more extensions for you. And so now, my friends, I am afraid that this is my final opportunity to address you as the director of Hawaii Volcanoes Observatory. And that I will be leaving on the morning to be able to take up residence in the Manoa Valley, where I will be on faculty at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. It is with a great deal of regret that I leave this island home, which has been my home for 28 years. The work that we have accomplished here in that length of time, I'm very proud of. And I leave the observatory in the very capable hands of perhaps the greatest seismologist in the world, Roy Finch. And you can depend upon him to be able to continue with the prospect of being able to alert you when there are distant earthquakes that potentially might give you tsunamis here. And I know that you can count on him for the future. I appreciate the absolute warm reception that I and my staff have received here on the island of Hawaii. Isabella and I have enjoyed the time that we spent at our second home in Kealakekua, just below Christchurch, and the wonderful friends that we've made there. Our neighbors, Dr. and Dorothy Mitchell, have become wonderful neighbors, and we're very pleased with them. And we've been warmly received by the families in the Malca regions, particularly the Greenwell family, and they've been visitors not only at our home here, but also at Kualono. And we've been very pleased to do that, even though some of the boys were quite intimidated by the walk across the bridge to be able to get into Kona. But it is with a great deal of regret that Isabel and I prepare now to leave Hawaii. And I thank you very much for your very kind attention this evening. Thank you. My understanding is that you have a tradition of questions and answers.
Would anybody like to ask a question?
The question was, did my staff or I ever explore the relationship between earthquakes and tsunamis? Of course. That's the easy answer. The difficult question is, or the difficult answer is, which particular set of earthquakes and which particular set of tsunamis. And we've discovered in monitoring earthquakes around the globe that we have the opportunity to be able to predict by their wave patterns what the reaction will be of water surrounding those areas. How many people are familiar with the great earthquake that happened in San Francisco in 1906? Okay, so some of you may remember it. It's quite a disaster. The Bosho Omori thermometers that we use at Hawaiian Volcano Observatory presently were the same instruments that had recently been set up in the basement of the Weather Bureau in Washington, D.C. The Bosho Omori thermometer gave a signal indicating that there had been a massive earthquake. The problem is there was only one Omori thermometer on the North American continent. It just showed that there had been an earthquake out west somewhere. But we had no way of being able to tell where until 45 minutes after the earthquake had taken place. A cable came to the Weather Bureau upstairs to tell them that their office in San Francisco had been devastated by a massive earthquake. That's how sensitive these instruments are. We were able to record the effects of a landslide, an earthquake that occurred in Chile. And we were able to predict a tsunami that would be coming. And we warned the police department that that would be coming, and they took the opportunity to heed our warning, and they alerted the populace in Hilo and cleared the beaches, and the tsunami arrived 5 minutes later than we predicted. So it's become such an important tool that an entirely new set of people are monitoring those kinds of instruments to be able to predict when tsunamis will affect the Hawaiian Islands. The question was, why am I so interested in waves? When you go to the beach, you ever just sat in the shallows and looked at the ripples underneath and wondered, how did those happen? And that fascinated me, enough so that I could write an entire doctorate thesis on it. And the wave tanks that we built at MIT were in use for that purpose for almost 30 years after I left. It is a fascinating part of science, is the material of waves, especially waves that roll up onto a very gently rising beach. They have a particular set of dynamics, and the mathematics that are involved in that are quite spectacular. And I encourage you, the next time you go to the beach, a nice gently sloping beach, get into the shallow water and look at wave patterns that are formed there. And if you don't become totally enthralled with it, then maybe you should get your vision checked.
Can you pinpoint any particular regrets about your work at Kilauea, things that you missed or things you wish you'd done?
I have very few regrets in my life. Possibly the most notable, when I first arrived at Kilauea, I was here by myself. My wife had recently given birth and was staying behind, and she didn't join me until sometime later. And regrettably, during that period of time, a young woman that I had hired to assist me in recording data, and I had a romantic dalliance. Emily Farley then confronted Helen Klein Jaggar, my wife, with the fact that she and I had had a very brief romantic encounter, and Helen was so put off by that announcement that she took the children and moved back to Boston. And from that time forward, I have only had the opportunity to visit with my children on 2 occasions. If there are any regrets, that would be the most significant. Yes, sir.
What can you tell us about the process of transitioning your work from private funding to the fact that it became a national park?
The question was to comment on the transition from private funding to a national park. Funding is not fun. Unfortunately, because of that dalliance that I had with Emily, my wife went back to Boston and destroyed my reputation at MIT. And the decision was made at the conclusion of our 5-year contract that they would not renew our funding. Observatories do not run with no money. And we sought every possible source of funding that we could find. And during the course of my tenure here, Hawaii Volcano Observatory has been funded by the National Park System, which I'll return to the National Park System in just a moment. It's been funded by the Weather Bureau, and finally, now it is funded by the Geodetic Survey, which has become the most stable source of funding. The National Park funding, and I might add the National Park System, period, at least in part, has happened because of me. My good friend, Mr. Thurston, made arrangements for me to speak to a joint session of Congress in 1916 about the need to preserve the summit of Kilauea into perpetuity by establishing Hawaii National Park there. And given the opportunity to address Congress, and without my very capable watch sitting next to me, I was allowed to go on addressing the Congress for 3.5 hours. It was entertaining. And they were entertained. And it was a wonderful opportunity to be able to expand on our need to be able to preserve certain lands in our country into perpetuity. And 8 days later, Congress passed the authorization bill that made for Hawaii National Park, and ultimately, a month later, passed the bill that authorized the expenditures to form the National Park Service. There being no questions, I thank you very much for your wonderful time.